Hi there. This is a quick video to provide an overview of the privatisation of education. And this might be for revision, it might be because you missed a lesson, or it might be simply because you want to go back over some of the theory. So you've watched the 6-minute tutor to you video, and this is going to build on the overview that you had there. So the first thing we're going to look at is Joel Spring. Okay. And Joel Spring talks about educational corporatism. So this idea of education becoming more corporate, but corporations also becoming more involved in education. So one of the points that Joel Spring makes, and I might need to just move myself over slightly here, is that TNCs are setting the education agenda. So we've got this idea that transnational corporations are actually coming along and they're saying, well, these are the skills that young people need. They're writing elements of curriculum like the Google digital skills curriculum that you can have for free and you can use with your students. They're running training for teachers, so you could be invited as a teacher. So I've been to the Google head office, I've been to the Apple head office, I've been invited in for free, and I've had training talking about ways that we can use their products with students. But of course, that is all kind of permeating out to students and to how the education agenda is being set. As well, we've got companies who are saying these are the skills that we need young people to have, and that's then impacting, talking about future skills and skills for the workplace, global skills that are needed. So these things are then being taken on board by schools and they're being built into curriculum and activities that students do. Something else Joel Spring points out is the digital divide. So we're talking about digital poverty and then digital privilege, really, and the gap between that. So that could be everything from Wi-Fi availability, but it could also include actual devices and the ability to kind of use those. We know that there's a big discrepancy across the world in terms of digital privilege, but also within the UK, so within the British education system, and obviously COVID lockdown, remote learning, that has made it very obvious. It possibly has helped in some ways as well, providing support for those who need it, but whether that will continue. So there is definitely a digital divide within the global economy and within the global education system. And one other thing that Joel Spring points out is that teachers have become disempowered through this privatisation, this educational corporatism. And many teachers may think, well, that's fine. We do want companies to be letting us know how to help our young people become global, members of a global economic workforce. However, what we need to question here is where education was always something that was free to everyone. It's free of charge. It was available to everyone. And teachers were the experts, but they were also the ones who their main objective is the young people that they're working with. Whereas these transnational corporations who are working maybe with schools and with the education sector, their core objective when it comes down to it is profit. So there might at some point be a conflict of interest there. So it's kind of an ethical, like a moral debate, really. Do we want to disempower teachers in favour of giving that power to people whose core objective may not be the young people? You could argue that their core objective is the young people because they want an excellent workforce, a global workforce to be available. So it is debatable, but the question is there. Okay, so that's Joel Spring. So let me just move myself over again to make this a bit easier to see. Okay, so privatisation, just remember it's the process where institutions are transferred from being state-owned to being private-owned by private companies. Where we saw this in the 80s with like British Gas, British Telecom, British Rail, National Rail, we saw those kind of in one go kind of being bought out by private companies and sold by the government, and therefore they became private providers instead of public sector providers. With education and with healthcare, with the NHS, it's different because we're seeing a kind of gradual privatisation of certain aspects. So it is different, it's more complicated. Examples of privatisation within the education system, things that are academies that are, private companies, especially if you think about like Harris Academies, ARC Academies, they can also be 10% funded by private companies as well. Free schools are completely private, so they're funded by the state. The money comes from the government, but free schools could be set up by companies, by local business people, by parents. So they are essentially private ways of setting up education. And then also we need to acknowledge that there has been an increase in the use of private providers within further education and higher education. So more and more private providers coming in and providing services within those sectors. So moving on here, what we're looking at is the idea that most aspects of education have been run by the state. And what we need to understand by that is it meant that schools were run by their local authorities, their LEAs, their local council, you could think of it as. And that's been a really significant change. And one of the arguments behind that was to make things more efficient so that the money could come straight from the government to the schools, and the schools have more autonomy, so they don't spend their time kind of filling out forms to ask for things and negotiating or gaining permission. So a lot more autonomy for school leaders. And of course, you can evaluate that by saying, well, at the same time, school leaders kind of lost autonomy because they got national curriculum and standardized testing and suddenly more pressure than ever. So it's a real kind of swings and roundabouts thing. However, with the increasing influence of these new right ideas on education, what we are seeing is that there is just a trend towards a new right thinking, and it's leading to this kind of trend towards a privatisation of these quite important aspects of education. And this is not just in the UK, this is globally as well. And that brings us to just really to kind of take that a bit further. What we have to recognise is that it's the taxpayers' money, rather than going to schools, is now a lot of it is going to private companies who are then providing those services to schools rather than the local education authorities providing them. And obviously your different sociologists on different sides of the coin are going to have different views on that. So the new right are going to support that because they'll see it as way more efficient, and your neoliberal, new right are supporting it. And then you've kind of got your critical theorists who aren't so sure about what's happening. And then you've got another kind of debate there where your kind of new Fordist and your new Labour supporters are kind of thinking, well, we do want some of this, but we're a bit worried about the kind of complete privatisation, and we don't want the government to step away from funding education. Whereas the neoliberals are going to say, yeah, the government should be stepping away from funding education because private companies are getting involved. So we've got lots and lots of different perspectives here. Okay, and then also just a point that can be a common mistake by students is that we sometimes say that all of the privatisation of the British education system has come from the Conservative Party and the new right government, and that's not true. So although a lot of the privatisation and marketisation started under Thatcher's government from 1979, it actually continued with New Labour. And we know as well that New Labour started the whole academy thing. So of course New Labour were a really big part of this, and New Labour are our kind of new Fordist, very enterprising kind of idea of education. And then obviously from 2010 the coalition have really continued with this privatisation of education. Okay, so that brings us to these two different forms of privatisation. So Ball and Udell did some work together in 2007 where they actually created this kind of typology. And they said, right, we've got exogenous education and then we've got endogenous education. And exogenous is the privatisation from outside, is the private companies getting involved, but the endogenous is more what we think of as this kind of marketisation, and where education is acting like businesses, so using a business model, and that being a form of privatisation. So when we talk about the companies, we're talking about coming from outside, and when we talk about the acting like a business, the business model, the consumer relationship and all of that, we're talking about endogenous, and that's kind of happening inside. So it's like an internal external split. So this slide's quite helpful because it's got examples on it. So I'm going to put myself like right in the middle, I think is a place where you can see everything else. So what you can see here is you've got some reminders about what the examples are. So above we've got exogenous privatisation of education, the involvement of companies. So we've got here, you've got PFIs and the idea that private schools and hospitals were allowed to borrow private money and pay it back, but it allowed them to kind of update their buildings and modernise without the government having to give them extra money. And then here we've got exam boards, Certain examples are now like Pearson, Edexcel is a global company, so the examples are kind of become these huge international companies. And then here we've got Google and Apple and those transnational corporations, like Joel Spring says, being involved in education, setting some of the curriculum, setting some of the standards of skills and expectations of young people. And also up there, we've got the academies having the 10% funding. So the 10% of the money to the school can be from private companies who kind of sponsor the school. And that's great, but it relies on the economy. So we did see in 2007 lots of schools who had a sponsorship from private companies. Financial crash happened, those companies couldn't do it anymore. So actually it's kind of a high level of risk if you're then making public sector schools vulnerable to wider economic influences like big financial crashes. So there's questions to ask about that. And then beneath here, we've got this privatisation in education. Endogenous or marketisation, you might think of it as, and this is kind of using a business model or business setup. And this could be all the things that you saw in the Tutor to You video, like setting performance targets and measuring things in a very business-like way. Performance-related pay as well is part of that. But also, as you can see down here, it's competition between schools. So this kind of league table competitive aspect, that's very business-like, isn't it? It's what we see in the private sector. And then here, parents as consumers, that entire change of relationship. So even formula funding is part of that, because it's about getting the customers to buy the place in your, to opt for the place at your school. And then, it's this consumer relationship. So you get the funding because you've attracted the customers. And of course, that's the same as sales revenue in business. Okay, so you might want to press pause here and make some notes on those individual examples, because when you write a paragraph about one of these things, you'll want to bring in a thinker, but you'll also want to bring in, one of these examples in a paragraph to back up the point that you're making. Okay. And then when you're ready to move on, we've got here arguments for privatisation, and then we're going to look at the criticisms of privatisation. So we're able to create these paragraphs which really show your balance, that you understand that there's these conflicting perspectives, and you can say, well, this side's saying this and this side's saying this, and you can show what the similarities and the conflict there. So the main perspectives which argue for privatising education are neoliberal and the new right. So it's neoliberal perspectives, that just means capitalist thinkers, and the new right obviously are neoliberal thinkers. So the neoliberal new right have said that state-run, so public sector education, is inefficient. It wastes time. It's bureaucratic. It is slower. It's just not got the same kind of efficiency as the private sector apparently has. So what they're saying, what the new right are saying, is that state-run organisations have this kind of bureaucratic self-interest, and that the stifling of like initiatives, it stifles innovation. It kind of just has like stifled low standards. There's not really evidence behind this, because academies coming in as like one of the biggest kind of privatisations that we've seen, all of the evidence, and if you go and look at things like the Sutton Trust and some of the big reports that have been done, I think Nuffield was one of them, they have shown that there is not there's not much of an impact, and there's been loads in the sort of reports in the news as well. There hasn't been a huge impact of academisation. So good schools have remained good schools, less good, poorer schools have remained poorer schools. There hasn't been a kind of big impact of doing this, what is supposedly way more efficient. So what the new right are arguing is to overcome all of this stifled lack of innovation and all this bureaucratic, nonsense, that really we need to privatise everything. And of course, in the 80s, we saw privatisation of lots of state-run industries. So the trains, gas, electric, British Telecom, telephone industry. And then obviously the next step along the lines of that argument would be schools and the NHS. So the argument for internal privatisation, this idea of marketisation, is that it's this whole thing that Chubb and Moe love this idea of, the increased competition is what they believe drives up standards. Now, firstly, we can compare that with Finland, where there isn't that level of competition, and standards are, according to PISA ranking, standards are higher in Finland. And there are lots of different measures of like Finnish education being more successful. And we could look at places like Estonia as well. But what the argument that we're being presented with from our new right government is that this level of competition will increase standards. And actually, we do have evidence that overall standards have increased. And this could be a correlation, or it could be simply coincidental because of other factors. But standards across education have increased over the last kind of 30, 40 years. And then finally, the argument for external privatisation, like bringing in these private companies, there's a real logic that, and this is what Chubb and Mo would support as well, this real logic that private companies are used to, like it's in their nature, that they need to bring down the cost, they need to minimise costs and maximise profits. And therefore, if we can get that private sector expertise and we can apply that to our public sector, then we're going to naturally be able to minimise costs and maximise profits. And that's a really good thing because then everything will be more efficient. And that would be way more efficient than local authorities, who traditionally were very kind of slow and very bureaucratic, and lots of people in the education sector were very frustrated with having to kind of work with LEAs. So that's the logic there. Okay, I think we're ready to move on. And then finally, we've got these criticisms of privatisation. So when you're weighing up, these might be your howevers, or if it was an essay that was about kind of the critical side, this might be your paragraph focus. So Stephen Ball gives us this brilliant concept of colorization. So this idea that we're trying to encourage brand loyalty from children. So these corporations, this like educational corporatism, they are getting involved. They want kids to have iPads. They want kids to be using Google. They want kids to be using Microsoft because they want to get those habits, and it's a sales process for them. It's not just that, but it's data. They get to harvest all of the data that comes from schools, and that's one of the things that you're kind of signing over when you sign up to using the education platforms. And that data, I mean, we're not talking about taking young people's kind of, personal like photos and things, but we're talking about habits, shopping habits, buying habits, lifestyle habits. And then they get to really see, a lot of that feeds into kind of marketing information and things. So that's, another argument why colorization is so beneficial for these businesses. And colorization could be everything from vending machines in schools at the simplest level, all the way out to having like big companies involved in offering private sector services within schools. Academies don't have to teach a national curriculum. Now, that's a criticism of privatisation, but most academies have chosen to teach a national curriculum because ultimately all the students need to be prepared for GCSEs. So it's kind of a bit of a non-point, really. But you could make the point and then you could weigh it up. So it gives you some evaluation. And then there's this other argument that if you're focused purely on profit, and all your schools are running like businesses, when you've got, say, 2 students in A-level music or A-level Spanish, modern foreign languages and things like music tending to be these kind of less taken subjects, it means that what the schools will have to do is say, well, it's really too expensive to pay a teacher to be teaching 2 students. So schools that don't combine provision with other schools locally so that they can make it work, they will cut those classes, and then you haven't got the breadth of education, you haven't got the choice available. And I've worked in places where this has happened and they've got rid of A-level music, they've got rid of A-level German, purely because of cost reasons. Philosophy, I think, as well, traditionally quite small class sizes. So the schools have had to get rid of them for financial reasons, so that they can run more efficiently, which is great from a new right perspective, not great if you want a breadth of education to be able to offer to your young people. And then Gilborn and Udell also have pointed out, throughout studies that we've looked at already, that privatisation and marketisation tends to, and Stephen Ball has pointed this out as well, tends to disadvantage those from working class backgrounds and those from ethnic minority backgrounds. Therefore, it's benefiting the affluent middle classes and it's not benefiting all aspects of the community. So that that shows that there's an inequality that's perpetuated by this level of privatisation. Okay. And then finally, just a reminder of what polarisation is. Stephen Ball's talks about the polarisation of schools, the private sector kind of penetrating schools, everything from vending machines to companies providing in schools. And it is the brand loyalty, the logos, the sponsorship, the kind of getting the habits. It's even why some of the banks come in and offer like a free savings account to all the kids in the school, and they'll do like a financial literacy workshop, and they'll give out lots of goodies with their branding on and everything. So that's NatWest do some brilliant links with schools, and I've worked with them before, and they provide amazing stuff, but ultimately it's because they want these young people to choose to bank with them. So there's the kind of conflict of interest there, isn't there, when we're talking about what really is the purpose of education, and should it become a commodity in that way, where we want to get hold of young people because they offer us like a chance for profits as private companies, or do we want education to be something that is always kind of free of charge, equal, and not with that kind of penetration of private business? Okay, so that brings us to the end. Go back and rewatch anything you need to, and press pause and kind of make your notes. And also, please do ask me any questions if you need any re-explanations of any of those areas. The next step will be writing practice, writing paragraphs and preparing for essays on these areas, and that will help you consolidate and embed a lot of this, what is quite complex information. So well done.